Welcome to Dr. Anne Hardy, who's a very good friend of ours, and I'm sure most of you already know Anne. She does some amazing work at the University of Newcastle. I need to read what it is you're coordinator of, otherwise I'll get it wrong. Coordinator of the Plamex and Digitisation Projects Hunter Living Histories Initiative at the University of Newcastle. And you also come along quite often and speak to us, and it's just wonderful to hear your talks and hear the wonderful history of the Newcastle area. And today Anne is going to talk to us about Watt Street and the very early part of Newcastle from around about 1801. I'm going to hand over to you, Anne, and you are so welcome. We are so looking forward to this talk. Thank you so much.
Yes, I thank you for the invitation. I guess Watt Street and this part of Newcastle, early part of Newcastle, has been a passion of mine for many decades. There's some familiar faces here from my former workplace at the James Fletcher Hospital through to doing my PhD. Jane, of course, who's done a lot of work with the Industrial Girls School. So what I thought I'd do today is just share a selection of images that relate to photographs, maps, plans that sort of give, I guess, a chronology, but also a bit of history around the different themes related to the Watt Street area. It's just layered and layered with all sorts of histories relating to the street. So just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the area and that Newcastle place name is Mullumbimba. Newcastle has got 5 or 6 places that are dual named in that part of, I think, Carrington, King Edward Park, Nobby. So yeah, we've sort of come slowly a long way in terms of acknowledging our Aboriginal heritage of the area, and understanding that this was a place, an ancient place that was used by Aboriginal people for thousands and thousands of years. And as was mentioned, yeah, the Plamex lab and the coordination that I do over at the university, we work with a lot of students, community, volunteers in our project. So we're always relying on our community to help sort of research and find some of our materials and work on projects with us. So yeah, like I said, just acknowledge any of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today online or here in the room with us. I wanted to start off with this engraving. I think it sort of depicts the area from a different angle. Often a lot of early colonial works done by Lycett and Wallace and Preston is sort of from Nobby's looking, or from the hill looking out to Nobby's. So we always get that lovely sort of scrapes, the view that goes up to Port Stephens, where this one is from Fletcher Park on the coastline, looking back over towards where the cathedral is today. So this is created by Preston and Wallace. So the whole culture of art making, even though it was sort of like place of secondary punishment, supposedly quite harsh treatment of the convicts, and we have these scenes that are actually quite beautiful, the way that they've been created. They don't show much sign of heavy industry, coal, even convict labour. And the theme through a lot of these really early artworks is that Aboriginal people are depicted. That in the area, some of the really early maps and plans show exactly where the natives were in the along the shoreline. So this is what they call the government garden. They had the government farm, which was down where the old Palais site used to be, and it was right on the edge of the river, where the government garden was just in that nice sort of gradual slope down from King Edward Park down to the water. It ended in what we know now as Church Street, and where the James Fletcher Hospital site was. So it was sort of a fairly fertile area. I had like a natural stream that ran through the middle. But this image here sort of depicts Aboriginal family in the foreground, a house, and it's sort of interesting the way it's been created, because we've got someone who's actually drawn it, and then we've got the engraver. So it was a real collaboration between government officials and, of course, Lycett was the other one involved. Now, this image here is a creation from the late Charles Martin. Charles was an architect, well-known architect in Newcastle, and he worked with us to really analyse a lot of the early plans and maps. He was very forensic in the way that he sort of used and understood and measured, and even the artworks that he used, he made sure that he used ones that were done by surveyors or might have been like as accurately sort of created as possible. And then he produced his own creation. So this is just a screenshot of a 3D fly-through. So online, if anyone's interested, I can share with them, but it's a video of early Newcastle in 1825. And it's actually got a scene where it sort of walks up Watt Street. So you get a really good idea of that early part of Newcastle and the Black Wharf, as it was called. It, of course, now has been reclaimed, and a lot of the foreshore is sort of expanded, and the for instance, the Dog Beach or that area there, it's the end of that wharf would literally be where the roundabout is now, if you're driving up Wharf Road. You can see the lumberyard was in a strategic position to make sure that the logs, the cedar that they were cutting down up the river, they're able to be floated down and then rolled in onto the shoreline there at the lumberyard. So the lumberyard's on the State Heritage Register. It hasn't been built on as such, but all the archaeology is still there. So yeah, Charles's work was really, quite significant in terms of the resources he had to do it, to create it. And that's available online for anyone who's interested. Now, this map here is one of an ice sketch that was done in, now I think that one's 1801, oh no, 1797. And what is interesting about this is that it shows where the natives, it says natives along the shoreline. This sketch was then redrawn, and a lot of that other detail about natives living in the area were not included. So it's important to sort of look at different versions of maps, because things can be rubbed out and be added, but you can see something different, you know, every time you look at a map, and particularly from a certain sort of perspective. It sort of shows, I don't know if there's a little tracks sort of here, but sort of the area there are hilltops. But yeah, you sort of get a good idea of what the harbour was like. There weren't sort of, there was nothing sort of between, of course, Nobby's Island and where Fort Scratchley is today. There's a little note here that says track from Port Jackson. So again, you just think, okay, is that a track in terms of, it's in the water. So I just think they probably refer to that. It's the shipping lane. It's not a physical track, but it's good to really zoom in and have a look at the early names. Here's Point Flinders. A lot of the names of the islands in the river have changed. And yeah, so that's sort of one of the really early maps that I thought I'd share. And this one here, probably many of you have seen, the Ferdinand Bauer. There was an original sketch that is missing, and this was done on linen in the 1860s. So it was sort of a copy of the original. No one seems to know where the original is. We've reached out to a few institutions to search their archive. Ferdinand Bauer was a natural history illustrator, mainly of plants. And this was the only landscape drawing that he did in the colony. So it's interesting that he sort of chose to do it of Newcastle. This shows what did then become what street. And as you can see, there's like a little cottage there that is probably the first government house. We know that the first government house was built in 1804 and it was portable. So it was a prefabricated house that they brought on a boat. So we're presuming that's it. It is quite a larger house compared to some of the smaller huts. And we think these are tents. Interesting imagery up here on the left-hand side. The area was also referred to as Prospect Hill. So maybe this is something to do with, testing the prospecting of coal that might have been available on the hill. So that's sort of an interesting landmark. The other interesting little feature is this smallish, it looks like a little fence or something sort of caged in. Maybe that was a test trench and they've just put something around it. But yeah, it's a really quite beautiful illustration that was done originally in 1804 to show what early Newcastle looked like. And those early descriptions of it looking like sheep pasture, I just think, well, that's pretty accurate. The other interesting feature that I've only just noticed in a few artworks is there were quite a few trees. Even though there's a lot of grass on this slopey area here, this area here later became known as the sand hills because the trees were removed and then the sand sort of swept in. So in here you can see that the stability of the vegetation was pretty much intact in that area. This one's lovely. It's done by Lewin, who was a professional artist in the colony. And apparently there wasn't a lot of work for the professional artists, so the government authorities put a lot of the professional artists to work doing government related artworks and surveys. So even though it's aesthetically quite nice, he's put in all the harbour depths, written all over it, Kingstown and Newcastle. So it was at that era where there was probably just a bit of debate on the name of the town. And I think that was done around 1807. Again, most of you have probably seen this one, but just sort of concentrating on what street and the wharf. You can see how well planned it is, and there's no signs of coal mining or even carrying coal, which apparently they did in barrows down to the wharf to export. No sign of convicts. It's all pretty stark. The only people in it, again, are Aboriginal people in the foreground. I think there's two groups with their fires. But the purpose of it is quite interesting, I think. It's part of a panel, a second, not quite a panorama, but there is another illustration that sort of joins onto this one. Now I'll just try to zoom in just on this area here. So the street is named High Street, then become George Street, then Watt Street. The town on here, it was sort of also later referred to like Danger's plan and the grid that was sort of imposed on the hill. Coal yards and that little track that sort of goes over to Newcastle, what we know as Newcastle Beach today. But it's sort of doesn't sort of show much else along Watt Street or High Street as it was called. But yeah, that sort of concentration on focus on coal just shows that the wharf was close and that came there. Yeah, this one's sort of similar to Ferdinand Bauer in that you can still see there's that heavy sort of tree-lined area, I guess, from the harbour across to Newcastle Beach. Newcastle East hasn't been developed, so that was probably the earliest suburb of Newcastle after like the old town of High Street, and then we get over in Newcastle East, like the first suburb of Newcastle in the 1850s and 60s with all those lovely sort of development over there. But yeah, I just thought that sort of doesn't show that sand drift or any of the issues that they had later when they started building there. Now this plan here shows George Street, the extension of Watt Street up to Church Street. And then beyond that, it was just like you walked up the hill. There was no street that extended, but it does show like government area, and they're starting to extend the town uphill towards the King Edward Park area. The churchyard, we use this plan to superimpose over Google Earth when we were sort of told about some records that related to the murder of Balogun, and we found sort of sketches down at the State Archives. So these old maps are sort of quite good to superimpose and just get an idea of where, even though the streets have changed a lot, to get an idea of where they sit in terms of Google Earth and what's on them today. This is probably the most significant image that relates to Watt Street that was done in the 1820s by Edward Close. For a long time, they thought they were done by somebody else, but they've been confirmed that they're definitely Edward Close, who was a surveyor. Morpeth was developed around his presence in the community, and his family sort of lived up, and I think they had Closeborn House. So there's that connection between the harbour and then that further development in Morpeth. So his illustrations are actually quite accurate. We've had people sort of look at them in terms of how they might have been created. That there was the camera obscura method that was sort of set, and the sketching was done so that it did sort of align to something that was sort of accurate, and it would have been quite a technique. So sort of looking at what's there physically to then sort of sketching it. So the engineers and the surveyors were trained in drawing, and this has been used a lot to really confirm the size of the buildings, how many rooms and things like that, and the scale of them. And then up on the left-hand side, we see the second government house, and that was sort of on the line of Watt Street, looking down over the harbour, and a good view sort of out to Nobbies to basically sort of see what was happening in terms of convict labour and people sort of working the early colony settlement. Now this it's just sort of to demonstrate, I guess, the government domain precinct. So the area of the current James Fletcher Hospital and Fletcher Park is now listed on the State Heritage Register. This map shows where the asylum shaft is. So there's a couple of really old sort of historic coal shafts on this particular site that date around the 1807 sort of onwards. And it was before the AA company took over, sort of commercialising as a private entity coal mining in the early part of Newcastle. So these were government-owned shafts. And then on the site, there's sort of that slow evolution and towards it becoming like a military site. It was sort of owned and managed by the British Ordnance, so that's why we've got Ordnance Street at the top of the site. And it was sort of a military site until around the 1840s, and then it sort of fell into disuse and had a whole lot of different other uses after that. But the site today is actually quite open. If you walk in there, it's got a beautiful parade ground. It's got the original military barracks. And this is just a timeline of the use of the site. Like I said, the early coal had the government house, and the AA company had they had their offices in there, as well as the Newcastle Volunteer Rifles. And then the Girls' Industrial School and Reformatory were there from 1867 to 71. So for that short period of time that the girls were there, they made quite an impact, as a lot of Jane's research will tell you. The records, when I started looking at the history of the James Fletcher site, hadn't sort of been located. They were a really unusual record because it was technically a school, but it was such an early school that the records were sort of tucked away and sort of missing. So it wasn't until I met Jane that she sort of started to find a lot of these records, and then the stories then just flew out of that. But it just shows there's records that can be misplaced in archives. And I think, yeah, just to continue asking archivists and researchers at institutions about what you're looking for. And then there was what was called the lunatic asylum for imbecile and idiots, which is completely inappropriate name and language that we wouldn't refer to as today. And it sort of set off, I guess, the whole history of the site being related to mental health and that change in sort of caring for people with mental health in the settlement. It was the third public institution in the world to specifically care for people with intellectual disability. So from that came Stockton and then Morisset. But it sort of took in a lot of migrants, a lot of single men in the colony that came out probably during the gold rush. And then they didn't have family, they were unwell, they were aging, and yeah, that first influx of people, patients that were admitted there were a lot of aging sort of people. So the different name changes. There's a Newcastle Hospital for the Insane, then Mental Hospital Newcastle. And a lot of people commonly still refer to it as Bott Street. So that's the government house. That was an artwork that was created by Edward Close. And it sort of, like I said, would have sat right in the middle of the roadway of where Bott Street is today. We've got the early base of the windmill and another little house there. And this is a map done by John Armstrong in the 1830s. And again, by 1830, it's named Watt Street. It's still got the jetty, but you can sort of see that we've sort of got the names of a lot of the buildings along Watt Street. So this actual thing is used a lot for historical research of the street and archaeologists, because it does sort of show you the footprint of where some of those really early colonial buildings were. When I was sort of researching Government House, and there's some researchers that was sort of saying that the house had been demolished or been destroyed by fire in the early 1820s, but then, you know, this map appeared and the building is still physically there. So I think it's always good to go back and sort of check primary sources, but a lot of history that's written can just get repeated through, particularly a lot of written sources. And it could have had a fire, but then been repaired. So it was interesting to sort of find that that actually hadn't burnt down. And the other interesting feature of that building is that there's, it's referred to as a commandant's house, but then there's another building that I'll show you. It's also called the commandant's house, and it still exists on the James Fletcher site. And I was sort of curious to know that, you know, well, what was the possible connection? Was it that, you know, one was demolished and they decided to rebuild something in its place and named it saying it's very symmetrical, similar to the former government house. But this map is over in the National Archives in Kew in the UK. And it would have been done by the British military to sort of map out where sort of potentially have their barracks built. So you can sort of see here there's the parsonage, which is was on the corner of Church and New Common Street. And yeah, they were sort of thinking about this whole area up to where the old coal pit is, that's up on the old bowling club site at Kennedy Park. And again, the Commandant's house still exists. But yeah, this is the interest from the British Ordnance in terms of them having their eye on the place and what they could do with it. And this is another one. Again, they've mapped it out. They've already put in like their military buildings that they were thinking of building, the guardhouse. But yeah, they've got all the dimensions. And the old parsonage is was part of the Anglican Church, and it's had a really interesting sort of history in terms of ownership. But it was demolished back in the late 2000s, probably 2009, and that dated from 1818. And yeah, it's quite a significant sort of building on the James Fletcher site. So this is a photograph of the volunteers that were training on the site. So during that period of it being sort of redundant and left by the British military, and then the Industrial Girls' School, they would just, yeah, train over a weekend. That's Church Street behind, and the courthouse isn't built, so sort of just shows how open the area was. And this looks like a cricket pitch, so it was used by like different groups in the community. And that's another one showing the field ambulance training. These buildings here are still there, and they're practicing drill. So it's a quite essential part of the town that, you know, people could get there quite easily. But at the same time, it's sort of a hidden, protected area behind the walls. And this is on the military parade ground. So all that's open space today. the roundhouse that used to be on the site was also foreshortened clinic. It was the concrete, it sort of would have been up the top here, just below the wall. So all that area of the site had been sort of levelled out really early so that it could be used. So it was sort of flattened so that it could be the use of the military. And this is an image that also depicts the site. It's a panorama that I located down at the State Library, probably in the mid-2000s. And I was sort of going through a few albums of unidentified images, and I just happened to open this album and the panorama just flew out of the book. I just knew it was Newcastle straight away. Beach nobbies there. I think because I've been focused my research on like the James Fletcher site, it was pretty obvious what it was from. And it sort of shows that the gardens that we have got some lovely photographs that were done by Ralph Snowball, shows like, yeah, the area that was used during the time of the asylum, and the lovely gardens that were in there, and how sort of desolate, I guess, this area up the hill was. But yeah, it was quite a find because it also shows that part of Newcastle East still sort of not being too overly populated, but just some development slowly creeping out there. So yeah, that's the image by Ralph Snowball. And yeah, sort of shows that area in the previous photograph, but how well designed the gardens were. It was used by the patients at the James Fletcher site because at the time the superintendent, Frederick Kane, he was a big supporter of open air therapy, fresh food, activity. He was a Quaker, so I think his philosophy was very much around just that natural therapy. He didn't have any medical background. He was a landscape gardener. So I think he probably did get a lot of people active inside, and yeah. So that's sort of called the women's side of the asylum. There's a guy up a ladder here who's doing a bit of painting. They also housed young children and toddlers in the hospital. So see how they probably needed to sort of protect kids from falling off the balcony. They started putting some gratis and keeping them safe. Now this is another image that I got from the National Archives in the UK. So these are all the original architectural plans of all the buildings that were built by the military. So I think the irony is there was so much money and time and effort went into building these. I think they were finished around 1841, but then by 1850 they were pretty much redundant. So it's like they were purposely built, but they've continued to be used for other purposes over time. It's quite an interesting site. They've been fairly well maintained by Hunter New England Health. It's a site that's sort of been closed to the community, even though it's a public health hospital. People can go in if they want, but it's that sense that it's a mental hospital and it's out of bounds. It's actually helped protect the site. You don't have like too many people walking in or damaging. Even when the site was empty, when it relocated to the March at Waratah, I think the site was vacant for about 5 years. As far as I know, there was minimal vandalism. It's quite interesting. But that building is still there today, and that's the earliest hospital building in Newcastle. It's the building that I referred to earlier that is often called the Commandant's Cottage. As far as I know, Commandant never lived there. It was built as a military hospital. So it still exists. Yeah, 1841. it's quite large inside. That area up there, I remember going to an event up there and they put about 60 people upstairs, so it's quite large. And then we've had superintendents of the mental institutions live in it with their families. And I think as late as probably 1990s or early 1990s. Then it became Monet's, which was a cafe, became a library, a few different other uses. But yeah, it's really quite a sturdy house that hasn't had any much sort of damage over the years. That's another plan from the UK Archives. And again, that's sort of the building today. But even though they've put in car parks, there are things that could potentially be removed in the future if it was ever to be sort of brought back to having something that was sort of open. The verandas are being sort of closed in. It's now used for outpatient mental health and other mental health organisations use the site, but there's no inpatients that live in the older buildings. The only inpatients that are on the site are on the corner where the parsonage was demolished, and it's sort of like a medium stay facility for people that are sort of transitioning out of hospital. So it's changed a lot in terms of what its former use was, but I worked there as a social worker. My former colleague, Steve Tyson, is here, which is lovely to see him. It was a fascinating place to work because even though you're working in old buildings, the care was good, the staff were good, everyone sort of managed as well as possible. The positive features about the site was that it was away from busy traffic, noise. It's a little oasis in terms of trees and grass, and you could hear the ocean. It was, yeah, really quite an unusual, like a really positive place to work too. And this is a plan that was created by the government architect, Barnett. And the site was old, but I just think the efforts that the government architects went to in trying to beautify the place. And the detail in this, yeah, is quite amazing. That sort of goes down to even like the clothes props out in the back, behind the wall of New Common Street. You sort of forget that it's sort of a site that's almost like a colony that had plumbers, it had some electricians, all the staff needed to keep the place sort of running, boilermakers, engineers, and even sort of when I left, like in the early 2000s, that they still had all their staff on site. So a lot of the buildings that were built were for the staff managing the site. And we've got also where they had poultry and an aviary. They had a grotto, fountain. So yeah, they put a lot of effort into making the site as beautiful as possible for the patients when it became mental health facility. So that one's online if anyone's interested in it. But yeah, I also thought it was interesting for a government architect to be sort of working on a landscape architectural design. And this is across the road in Fletcher Park. So Frederick Kane, who I think was the instigator of a lot of the gardens at the James Fletcher site, he's set to work then beautifying the Fletcher Park and up to the James Fletcher site. So yeah, his impact, I think, was felt in that then this area became like a public park and set up a beautiful drinking fountain made out of wrought iron. James Fletcher, who's still standing up on the hill, and his connection isn't so much to mental health, but the name, it's interesting that the hospital took on the name, but I think it was more his influence in terms of his use of the site. And he used to have, he was known as like friend to the miner. He used to have like a lot of meetings. One newspaper article talked about like 5,000 meetings on site to sort of campaign and rally for like the rights of miners and people in the area. Again, the lower reserve, they're our snowball images as well. They're like quite detailed. Don't know who this gentleman is, but he's likely the Council of Garden. Now this early image of Watt Street shows the corner of Church and Watt Street. So, you know, this building doesn't exist today, but it sort of just shows that the evolution of, you know, what the streetscape looked like. The council building is there, of course, Custom House is there, but yeah, it's slowly sort of changing over time. Now this house is where Wirraway flats were later, so on the corner of Watt and Church Street. And it was quite a solid house used for accommodation and boarders. But yeah, quite a decent sort of sturdy looking house. And this image shows the Great Northern Hotel. It's been demolished and rebuilt several times, I think about 3 times. And then what is the George Hotel here? And horse and carts, quite a wide street. But yeah, it just shows what's the streetscape look like. A few verandas that you don't sort of see much now along that street. It's just another one of the earlier, again, 2 earlier pubs in the street. This one's sort of the National Bank of Australia. It still exists, but only the facade. So it's on the corner of Watt and Hunter Street, and it's had the buildings either side in Watt Street demolished, and there's housing development going up. But I thought that's an example of like a beautiful streetscape, and that sort of culture of facadism is quite alive and well in Newcastle. That was taken in 2009. So these 2 buildings on the left, like I said, have been demolished. But that was sort of an area that related to like shipping agencies and offices that had that sort of direct impact on you know, the trade that was happening in Watt Street and on the wharf. Skate shop that was there for a long time. So this building is called the John Reed. Yeah, so that's, that building, the skate shop. It was, John Reed. It was one of the shipping companies. Now, the Tattersalls, I added this because I hadn't really seen any photographs of the Tattersalls Club. I knew that it existed and then it had alterations and was modernised probably in the 1980s and 90s, but the original one was quite an Art Deco design. It's sort of right next to the Great Northern Hotel. But yeah, I thought I'd just add that one because it's not one that I've seen very often or there's many photographs. Nor this one, which is called the Hotel Orient. And that was in Watt Street, between Hunter and Church Street. I think we've got the T&G building on the corner, and then that was like a little hotel tucked in there. Looking at that, you'd wonder why you demolish it, because it's quite quaint. it almost looks English, British. It's sort of really beautiful architecture. And the Union Ship Steamship Company, it still exists. And yeah, quite unique in terms of its architecture. And these are all on, there's about 6 that are on the State Heritage Register, and others are sort of listed for heritage significance. And this is manufacturing, Mercantile House. And again, I think that really adds to the streetscape of Watt Street, showing, you know, just the older architecture of the early 20th century. And the council chamber, it's still there, and it's open to the public, and it's like a club people can join, and it's more like a museum than a club. You go there and there's a lot of artifacts and war memorabilia. But, you know, do you think that that sort of still exists as the City Hall, as the old council building before the one went up at the Civic? And the Beach Hotel, that's a good photograph because it sort of shows that, you know, the Newcastle Hospital, that of course isn't there anymore, but it sort of just shows that, you know, that streetscape changed a lot from being a hotel to then having the David Madison building built on that site, which also suited a corner. It was very modern, of course, but there's sort of, it's another, I think, pub. There's not a great deal of photographs of that actual image. And this aerial photograph of Watt Street shows, yeah, that like all that parking that went on behind the terraces and behind Church Street. You get a good view of the James Fletcher site and the courthouse, the old Wirraway flats, and this church, St Philip's Church. Yeah, it's sort of quite a bit of change has sort of happened since this was taken in around the 1960s. So David Madison, the history behind him is that he had a lot to do with psychiatry, and that focus again of bringing back psychiatry and the theme of mental health to that street is quite interesting. At the uni we have the David Madison Archive, and he's, yeah, that whole theme of health and public health institutions in Newcastle brought like a lot of, I guess, life to the city, a different community. Yeah, when I think the Royal Newcastle Hospital closed, and then the David Madison, it sort of did change that whole feel of the city, not having as much sort of that presence of health. And an aerial shows that, yeah, distinct difference in the architecture. So these terraces are all on the State Heritage Register. The old Wirraway flats in there being demolished. But this, yeah, this just shows, oh, actually that hasn't come out too well, but the blue areas are all the areas that on the State Heritage Register. So we've got King Edward Park. We haven't got the bowling club site. It was sort of excised. We've got the James Fletcher site, the cathedral, and then sort of pockets of other property. And then down towards the wharf, we've got the convict lumber yard, and the whole of Newcastle station, the former station, is on the State Heritage Register. There's nothing on the Commonwealth Heritage List in Newcastle. It's sort of mainly all national listing. And I thought I'd add this one because The theme of parades, and even the Matara used to have a lot of their parades come down Watts Street, and particularly before Civic Park really become more evolved as a public park. The processions would sort of congregate up near Ordnance Street and then come down Watts Street. So this is a lovely one that was created by all the staff at the store back in 1960s, and it took them apparently a whole year to start planning and working on it and bringing it together. We did an oral history project about 8 years ago, and it was to sort of promote and capture stories related to people that worked at the store. And Terry Stanmore, who's a window dresser, so all those famous windows that people still have memories of, he was very creative and artistic, so he was sort of the force behind putting this together. And they used to have stage on store, which was like a bit of a pantomime fundraiser. But yeah, the creativity that I think a lot of those processions for people that worked for different organisations to be able to sort of put something together. So we've got quite a few images in the archive that sort of shows the use of Watts Street around these type of parades. And I thought I'd just promote, while I'm here, a current exhibition that's over in Special Collections. It's called Rewind, and it's a retrospective of photographs that relate to the NBN television archive. So we've been fortunate to have quite a few former staff of NBN television digitise all the magnetic tape. Now they moved on to the film in the 1960s to the 70s. We also have like a lot of photographs, so that's what the exhibition sort of highlights, some of the photographs that relate to the whole era of television in Newcastle in the 1960s and 1970s. And sort of put it together. A lot of the students really like it because it's sort of an era they haven't ever seen before, experienced, and it all relates to analogue. Quite different. This exhibition's on until mid-September if anyone's interested in. But yeah, look, if there's any questions or if you want me to go back to any images, if anyone's got any sort of questions around presentation.
The pictures of the military training, citizen militia or whatever, what are you looking at? Are they in the First World War or
No, they'd be early, they'd be 1860s. Yeah, because the Industrial Girls' School were on the site in 1867. So it would have been slightly, look, they could have even trained there while the girls were there. There's a possibility of, the use of the site. It's like everyone wanted a bit of it sort of thing. So it could have been that it was still used during the late.
So they were full-time military people?
No, so they're all volunteers. So there were volunteers that would just train there a couple of times a week. And it would have been probably, leading up to, it was when the colonies were given autonomy to have their own military. So there was a real push to have volunteers trained. Yeah. Army Reserves, yeah. And there's some of them, I don't know, they might have gone off to the Boer War, but those photos are with the local studies in Newcastle.
I like the fact that the fence hasn't changed. I have those
Yeah, actually, the quite sturdy.
Modern fence.
It is a modern fence. You get quite a surprise, particularly with that site, because, like I said, that's all open. They have sort of put some nice little neat gardens in, but it's pretty much unchanged. And I think that's what makes it quite special. and it hasn't come under threat of development because of the mines, I think, underneath.
Now,
So
they're
I think-
training out front of the old hospital, which was the premises where Elaine Scott lived.
Yes,
So maybe that's where they were, because
yes,
there was a fence that ran between Scott's home
and,
and the school,
yes,
and that may very well be it.
actually there, that fence, yeah,
Because they're in front of Scott's premises at that point.
they are,
In the 70s, and can't imagine, I found nothing that suggests they trained on the premises of the school.
Mm,
That would have been chaotic,
mm,
because the girls were very, very big.
yeah, yeah. So if you read some of the wiki entries that James put together and the newspaper articles are just very descriptive.
Tradesmen drove them mad.
Yeah, and because there wasn't photography to describe what was going on, the descriptions are just quite amusing. They were quite feisty girls. At one point, they sent a posse of police from Sydney for 3 months to keep the girls in check. But yeah, I think, and one of them said they were worse than any like convict men, like the way they behaved and the way they were managed. But there was also some really positive stories and the girls standing up for themselves. And one, Jane can probably tell more about it, but she represented herself.
I do know that that fence was not very secure, because one of the girls who escaped was coaxed with an egg on the promise of connection, and she got out under that fence.
Oh, does anyone else have any questions or any comments?
I was just going to say, the roundhouse part, what year was that built? And was that classed as part of the Watt Street precinct? Or was it just sort of void, so out of sync with the rest of the?
Yeah, look,
The architecture?
Steve Childs might know a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's 60s or 70s. It was part of, there's quite a few of those buildings around the state. It was part of a therapeutic community type of attitude to mental health. It's a different approach. There's one down in North Shore Hospital called Cummins Unit. There was one on Parramatta Hospital. So they're all built in the same sort of style.
Thank you, Anne. That was just so fabulous to see all of those amazing photographs and plans. We've all probably seen some of them, but not, we haven't seen them all put together like that. And it's just wonderful to see.